CRM was supposed to improve customer relationships. Instead, it's shorthand for can't resolve much. Which means you may have sunk a fortune into software that just bounces customer issues around but never actually solves them. On the ServiceNow AI platform, CRM stands for something better. With AI built into one platform, customers aren't mired in endless loops of automated indifference. They get what they need, when they need it. Bad CRM was then. This is ServiceNow.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. And by popular demand, this week, I'm just going to crack on with it.
Lord, it's a miracle!
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
In movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as it's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, is given away by the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about production stories, marketing stories, release stories, distribution stories. All the ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation that somehow, films manage to get made. Film Stories is also a very proud part of the Film Stories podcast network, a network of over 50 film, TV, gaming shows. If you just do a search for Film Stories Podcast Network, hopefully you'll find a couple of other things there to entertain your eardrums. But right now, I'm focusing on film stories, and in each regular episode, of which this is one, I talk about the stories of two films. So let's get on with the first. I'm going to take you all the way back to 1994. I'm going to set things up, as ever, with a clip from the trailer. You'll hear the story of this particular movie, The Other Side of This.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard all the evidence. This was revenge. He fired the gun empty and then stopped to reload.
You strike me as a remorseless man, Mr. Dufresne. I hereby order you to serve 2 life sentences back to back.
I send you here for life. That's exactly what they take.
I'm Mr. Norton, the warden. I believe in 2 things: discipline and the Bible. Here you'll receive both.
Why'd you do it?
I didn't, since you asked.
You gonna fit right in. Everybody in here is innocent. Hey, what you in here for?
Didn't do it.
He had a quiet way about him. A walk and a talk that just wasn't normal around here.
On the outside, I was an honest man, straight as an arrow. I had to come to prison to be a crook.
I think it would be fair to say I liked Andy from the start.
Right then, picture this. 1994's The Shawshank Redemption, only directed by Rob Reiner and starring Tom Cruise and Harrison Ford. It very nearly happened, but let's get into the story. 1994's The Shawshank Redemption, of course, in the end, starred Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman, written and directed by Frank Darabont and based on a Stephen King short story called Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption. Also in the cast of the film, Bob Gunton, William Sadler, Clancy Brown, a lot of guys, Gil Bellows, James Whitmore, shot by Roger Deakins as well, with a beautiful score by Thomas Newman. So, the start of this story, though, takes us to 1982, and that was when Stephen King published a collection of short stories going by the name of Different Seasons. So, Different Seasons is kind of 4 stories that don't have the usual supernatural stroke horror edge that Stephen King was certainly known for at the time. So, in that book, you get The Breathing Method, you get The Body, you get Apt Pupil, and Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption. And the quartet are based basically around different seasons of the year: winter, summer, spring, autumn. And he'd written them, but he hadn't submitted them earlier in his career because they weren't, his career was on the way up, primarily after Carrie in the mid-1970s. But they weren't conventional Stephen King stories. His brand at that point was more horror. I mean, he wrote books under the pseudonym Richard Bachman, such as The Running Man and The Long Walk, to kind of differentiate himself just a tiny little bit as well. There are better Stephen King experts than me. But this was 4 stories that you wouldn't necessarily expect from Stephen King. And so they were bundled together in this collection in 1982. They were, 30,000 words each. And notably, in 1986, The Body would be filmed by Rob Reiner. Rob Reiner filmed it as Stand By Me, and Stand By Me is an outstanding movie. Then, in 1998, after Shawshank, Bryan Singer, for it is he, would film Apt Pupil. And so this collection of 4 stories, 3 of them have been turned into films. Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption, shortly to be known as The Shawshank Redemption, would of course become the most famous of them all. Now, Stephen King there's a load of film adaptations of his work. Even as I'm recording this in 2025, The Long Walk and The Life of Chuck are in cinemas. 2 brilliant adaptations as it happens. But a lot of that comes from the fact that he's been a vehement supporter of upcoming creatives. This idea that he's got this program called Dollar Babies that some of you may have heard of. And the idea is that you can be a film student, something like that. If you want the rights to adapt a Stephen King book, you can have them in exchange for $1. The condition that you send him a copy of the film, and also you're not allowed to release it, but it allows people to make a film based on published works where otherwise they might hit all sorts of problems. Now, quite a few interesting films have come out of the Dollar Babies, and in 1983 there was an upcoming filmmaker, a writer really at that point, by the name of Frank Darabont. He was in his 20s, and he paid $1, handed over his single banknote to adapt The Woman in the Room. As per the terms of the Dollar Baby scheme, he sent that to Stephen King. Stephen King watches these, and let's face it, he must sit through a fair amount of less good, let's go with less good films. But he was impressed with The Woman in the Room. However, that wasn't the story that Darabont most wanted, because he'd been really taken with Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption. But he wasn't at that point in a position to he just didn't feel like he was ready. He didn't have a screen credit. And so the first screen credit would actually come along in 1987, and it would be for Nightmare on Elm Street 3. And at that point, as he told Vanity Fair, that was the moment where he's like, right, I'm going to hand over my $1. I'm going to try and adapt this. Now, that novella, call it what it is, Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption, doesn't even run for 100 pages and isn't immediately obvious how you would adapt it to film. Stephen King was one of those where he didn't really see where the film in it would lie. Maybe this one was best left as a book. But still, Darabont had it on his desk, but he was sidetracked by having to earn a living. And so he took on paid assignments on films like The Blob and The Fly 2, quite, deep genre stuff. And he was kept working at this. He kept chipping at it and realised he was sort of straying from King's text a little bit, inevitably so. And in the end, it was in 1992 he got it over the line. He got a script finished, and it was courtesy of an 8-week writing sprint, basically, to get this done. And so what he did is he fleshed out some of the characters. He combined some of the characters. He added a few plot points in there. He took this novella as an absolute base, but did a bunch of different things with it. So the film in the end is 2.5 hours. So what's that in screenplay? In screenplays, that's 140, 150 pages. It's already looking about the same length, if not longer, than the source material. But he had something here, and he got the permission of King to take this beyond $1 Baby and to turn it into an actual film. However, he was an actual commercial film, I should know. And he was still, though, known as a writer and not a director. But he sent the script out, and this was in 1992. And in 1992, the rocket fuel was applied to this particular project, because one of the companies where it landed was, wouldn't you know it, Rob Reiner's Castle Rock Entertainment. And it landed on the desk there of a producer called Liz Glotzer. Now, Liz Glotzer, as it turned out, and this was a detail also provided by Vanity Fair many years later, was a huge fan of prison movies. If a script went into the Castle Rock office for a prison movie, Liz Glotzer was going to read it. That was it. That was her thing. And so she read it, and boy, did it land with her. I mean, I've done loads of these film stories over the years, and often it's get the right piece of material to the right person at the right time. So there's a lot of flukes involved. So you look at, I don't know, Gremlins, the original Gremlins movie. Would that have happened if Steven Spielberg hadn't been walking out his office and just seen the name of the project on top of a bunch of scripts as he was going home for the weekend? Might never have happened at all. In this case, if Liz Glotzer wasn't an employee of Castle Rock, would it have happened? Because as it turned out, they'd had that book. They'd had this collection of stories in different seasons in the Castle Rock office because they'd adapted one of them. They'd just never read the next story. They'd never looked at the next one in the book. So Glotzer was blown away by the script, and as Hollywood legend goes, she threatened to resign if Castle Rock didn't pick up an option on Darabont's screenplay and on the film. So she passed it to the boss. The boss was Rob Reiner. By this point, he didn't just have Stand By Me to his name. He'd adapted another Stephen King story to the screen, 1990's Misery, the Oscar-winning Misery, Kathy Bates as Annie Wilkes in that. God, terrifying. So, I mean, he had form here. If you were going to do a good Stephen King adaptation, get Rob Reiner to direct it. That's a good idea. And so he agreed. He thought this script was great as well. And so it was picked up. It was a Castle Rock project. And then this is where it could have taken that very, very different turn, because I remember reading this story around the time about Rob Reiner being interested in directing it. But over time, flesh has gone on the bones of it a little bit, because Reiner was in the middle of his hot streak. So, he was going from The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, Misery, and then A Few Good Men came along. A Few Good Men with Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson and Demi Moore. And so he and Tom Cruise were interested in working together again. And so there was an idea there that Tom Cruise could come in and play one of the two lead roles in what was now the Shawshank Redemption, the role of Andy Dufresne. Now, this would have required a bit of jiggery pokery, because Tom Cruise was really interested in it to the point where he did a table read of the script. What he wasn't interested in doing was working with a first-time director. And this was a point where Frank Darabont was being set to direct, as well as his screenplay being used for the movie. Tom Cruise's deal to sign up for the Shawshank Redemption would have, at the very least, meant that Rob Reiner would be very, very hands-on the production. That this wouldn't be a case of Reiner's producing and leaving Darabont to do it and just like managing it from afar, one person in Hollywood, one on location. Reiner would have to be absolutely in the trenches on it. And so a deal was put to Frank Darabont that he could take an awful lot of money in exchange for not directing the film. And then Rob Reiner would direct it with Tom Cruise in the lead role. Darabont by this point was in his early 30s and was not awash with cash at all. And this would have been a life-changing sum of money. He'd been fighting to pay the bills, and now he was being offered stupid money to give up directing this thing that had been in his head for, by this point, 7-8 years since he'd first handed over his dollar bill. And Darabont admitted that he was, quote, completely tormented, unquote, by the offer. Then Castle Rock upped the offer as well. It wasn't just, we will give you the money not to make the film, not to direct the film, but we will finance any other film you want to make if you give the director's chair to Rob Reiner. He said, and again, this was quoted to Vanity Fair in the end, he said, "You can continue to defer your dreams in exchange for money and die without ever having done the thing you set out to do." And so, with some steel, he turned Castle Rock and Rob Reiner's offer down. Thus, Tom Cruise, at that point, one of the absolute most bankable film stars in the world, would guarantee a big opening weekend for the movie, was gone. With Darabont directing and Reiner hands off, wasn't going to happen. As Frank Darabont would reflect, it was a nerve-wracking decision to make. And also, it was a leap of faith, because Castle Rock, realistically, entirely within their rights to let him shoot the first few days, something like that, or bring him in for the first couple of meetings and then fire him for very little money, and Rob Reiner gets to direct it anyway. However, that wasn't how Rob Reiner was working. And instead, a $25 million budget was given to the production, with Frank Darabont getting $750,000 and a percentage of net profits to write and direct. Rob Reiner was described as a mentor to Frank Darabont through the making of the film, that he didn't interfere, he didn't get in the way, he supported. But there was that moment in time, that tiny moment where the story could have gone a very different way, because Reiner, with the press of a metaphorical button, could have had Darabont off the project, and then in comes Tom Cruise. Likely you would have got Harrison Ford in the co-role of Red, and instead you had a first-time untried director. But you did have this script, which whoever was reading it, it was going down an absolute treat. And so they were aiming high anyway with the casting. There were people in mind for it, such as Gene Hackman and Robert Duvall. Calls were being returned. People didn't take the script and just like ghost it or anything like that. There was all sorts of scheduling problems, which meant people like Hackman and Duvall weren't going to get near it in the end. It's unknown whether they'd have actually been cast. But it was Liz Glotzer who said, "What about Morgan Freeman?" What a suggestion, it would be fair to say. Morgan Freeman just said is one of the best, it's worth noting, one of the best scripts he'd ever received. Tim Robbins, in fact, would describe it as the best script he'd ever had. But there was still some putting together of the cast here, because Tom Hanks was sounded out, turned it down. Kevin Costner sounded out, said no. Tom Cruise, of course, did that table read in the end, said no. And it was Morgan Freeman in the end who mentioned Tim Robbins. Now, Tim Robbins had won Best Actor at Cannes the year before for Robert Altman's Glorious, the Player. And he had profile. He working with the Coen brothers on the Hudsucker Proxy, and with Adrian Lyne on Jacob's Ladder as well. In fact, it was Jacob's Ladder that really put Tim Robbins on Frank Darabont's radar, at least. But Freeman said, what about Tim Robbins? Robbins was interested, but there was a little bit of the same concern over the inexperience of the director. And it was said to have been Tim Robbins' condition that if you are going to have Frank Darabont, a first-time director, direct this film, you need an experienced director of photography. Any suggestions? Well, he'd just been making the Hudsucker Proxy with the Coen brothers, which was shot by a man called Roger Deakins. And thus, Roger Deakins was hired, and Roger Deakins, I think, would go on to shoot Robbins's Dead Man Walking straight after. Roger Deakins came aboard, working with Frank Darabont on the film. And then the cast was fleshed out with a lot of both upcoming and experienced character actors. I love the fact that Bob Gunton, who plays the warden, was shooting Demolition Man. I love Demolition Man. At the point he was having to audition for the Shawshank Redemption. James Whitmore, Clancy Brown coming in as well, William Sadler. There were a couple of flybys that Brad Pitt was interested in the role of Tommy, but then he had other offers coming in that he took instead. There was also James Gandolfini, Tony Soprano himself, but he elected to go and make True Romance with Tony Scott. Not a bad choice, really. Can't really argue with that. But with Tim Robbins on board, Morgan Freeman on board, the rest of the cast, it was preparation time. And so Robbins would, as Entertainment Weekly reported at the time, Robbins would meet with inmates in their cells at an actual prison. He would sit there. He would have his own arms and legs in shackles for a few hours. Whereas Morgan Freeman's approach was, pretty much the opposite. I don't think we're quite at the contrast between Dustin Hoffman and Laurence Olivier in Marathon Man. That's a story well worth looking up. But you had Robbins, who was going into prison. Morgan Freeman, however, tells Entertainment Weekly, acting the part of someone who's incarcerated doesn't require any specific knowledge of incarceration. He reasoned, presumably sat in front of a roaring fire with a nice glass of wine, if he's got any sense. He'd also been in a prison drama before, Brubaker, and he said, men don't change. Once you're in that situation, you just toe whatever line you have to toe. Shooting on The Shawshank Redemption began in June of 1993, and the script and all of those dealings had all taken place in 92, so this was moving fast. For the shoot itself, I mean, inevitably, they needed a prison. And like most of Stephen King's stories, Shawshank is set in Maine, but the production, it was a 4 or 5 month location scout to try and find a prison. They did not find one in Maine to shoot in. Instead, they ended up in a place, Mansfield in Ohio, and the Ohio State Reformatory. Now, the Ohio State Reformatory had been closed down in 1990 because it was deemed inhumane. The living conditions in it were deemed inhumane. And more than that, it wasn't just that it was absolutely deserted, it was scheduled to be demolished. I think it was said to be demolished in 92, 93. However, the location scouts found it and realised that they could do the vast bulk of the photography of the film there. As such, they had to persuade, in exchange for cash, which tends to help the local authorities in Ohio, to delay the demolition of the prison, which they agreed to do for a year, so that Frank Darabont and his production could come along and shoot The Shawshank Redemption. But what a shoot it turned out to be. It shot over the summer of 1993 in the heat, and it was 15 to 18 hour days by various reports that I've read. It was shooting for 6 days a week. They get Sundays off usually, something along those lines. In fact, once the film was done, virtually all the complex was destroyed. But for that period of time they were there, they were in an area that didn't have an enormous amount of Hollywood-esque amenities around. A cast and crew on location, spending 6 days in a prison shooting a film. And I mean, Darabont and the production team have brought in lots of former inmates as well, both to give advice and to inform for stories in the film. Also, some of the background artists in the movie might have been resident at said reformatory in the past, or certainly have worked there. And it was a concentrated, intense time. And I mean, just to pick a sequence, there's a sequence in the film where inmates are tarring a roof in beating sunshine. And I mean, to shoot that, they were tarring a roof in beating sunshine. Sometimes what you see is pretty much exactly what happened here. And with the sun coming down, what was happening was the sun was hardening the tar. And they needed to get a few different takes of this, because if you're familiar with the film, you'll know that there's a camera move that goes alongside narration. So Morgan Freeman's silky narration to the film that had to be right. And if you got it wrong, it's another take. And what do you know? You've got to put some more tar down, but that tar's hardened over there. And this is the reality of making a film on location in the summer. There were, I mean, not everything they did, it's worth noting, was shot in the prison itself. That the cells that you see, Darabont wanted them arranged in a certain way, and so they found a disused factory, a factory that closed down fairly nearby, and they put some sound stages on there and built the cells for the inmates on there. Also, like small little details of the film, Mark Kermode wrote a book, I think came out in 2003, on The Shawshank Redemption, and there's a bit in the film where they're watching a film in prison. I love movies within movies. I still don't think you can beat Robert De Niro watching the film Problem Child in the midst of Cape Fear, but that notwithstanding, in Shawshank Redemption, they watched the film Gilda, starring Rita Hayworth. It wasn't the one they were originally supposed to watch. That was going to be The Lost Weekend from 1945, a Billy Wilder film. And the problem was that they needed to license the footage for the film that they're watching from Paramount Pictures. And they approached Paramount, And they were given in exchange, once the bill came in too high, a list of films that would fit their budget that the inmates could watch in prison. And that's where Gilda came in. The day-to-day monotony of shooting the film, monotony might be the wrong word, but certainly intensity of it. I mean, Tim Robbins, in a story that was quoted by Entertainment Weekly around the time of the film's release, he just tells this story. Today we were reshooting a scene where I pick a maggot out of my oatmeal. And this was August. And it's worth noting, Entertainment Weekly noted it was a drought year at this point. 3 months of intense heat. And there he was picking out a maggot. And as Robin said, the first time we shot it, someone from ASPCA, animal cruelty organisation that monitors the use of animals in films, was on the set because we were using a bird that day. We were informed by the person that we weren't allowed to kill the maggot on screen. So then they had to reshoot it. And so, as Robin said, for the reshoot, someone made a little matchstick director's chair with a star on it, a maggot on the back. So they didn't kill the maggot. And in fact, in between takes, the maggot got their own director's chair on the set of The Shawshank Redemption. It wasn't the easiest of shoots, and some of these stories have come out since, that Frank Darabont was a novice director at that point, and Morgan Freeman, a very experienced actor. And while Tim Robbins sort of took the fifth a little bit when quizzed about tensions during the set, Morgan Freeman perhaps less so. That, Frank Darabont would reflect, I learned a lot. A director really needs to have an internal barometer to measure what any given actor needs, he would say. But Morgan Freeman's issue with him was that he talked about how Frank Darabont would insist on doing multiple takes for, quote, no discernible difference. And in the end, Freeman just got cheesed off and I'm just not doing it. And he said, as Freeman says, for me, someone who comes to the project as a writer first is not going to be a good director. And this was quoted in Entertainment Weekly around the time of the film's release. He's going to usurp my job. And Freeman said, you pay an actor for his expertise, and if you don't use it, you'll raise hackles. Now, later in that article, he talked about how Darabont had really well directed the film. But there was a point in there where Darabont was asking for take after take after take after take, and Freeman was just, no. Tim Robbins hasn't got on record with it, so I can't put words in his mouth there. However, another person that Darabont wasn't seeing eye to eye with really was Roger Deakins at certain points during the shoot. And they had a disagreement actually over how to shoot Shawshank itself, because there was a story that Darabont was looking for a few more outside shots, certainly outside the prison, to put it in some kind of geographical context. Deakins was arguing, you stay in the prison. Unless you absolutely need to for a couple of bits in the film, and you know what bits they are if you've seen the film, you stay in the prison. It is more claustrophobic if you keep the camera within the prison walls. And apart from one or two moments where the camera goes up, you're right in there with them. Because a lot of it was shot in that prison complex, and because the prison scenes were, pretty much laid down, the script was there from the start. They did shoot a lot of those in order as well, which helped. But still, by the time filming wrapped up in September 1993, it'd be fair to say that I think most people were ready to go home at that point. Now, the edit of the movie then goes into post-production. The edit was going to come down to just under 2.5 hours. And to get there, Darabont and his team, and the film is edited by Richard Francis Bruce, had to leave several scenes on the cutting room floor. And then famously as well, there's the ending of the movie. This is a very, very spoiler-like telling of the story, so I won't tell you what the ending is. Just that there is one version of the film that if it ended 30 seconds, a minute earlier, would put a lot more ambiguity on the ending than ultimately what we get in the movie. So they test screened The Shawshank Redemption, and test screenings went off the chart. Audiences went for it very, very fast. They were getting some of the highest test scores that they'd seen, and there was suddenly this feeling, hang on, we might have something here. This might actually be a hit. This could actually do something. And so one of the things that came off the test screenings as well, and certainly in the post-production process, is an argument over the ending of the film. And as I understand it, Darabont would have been quite happy if it had ended a little bit earlier on a note of hope. And against him was Liz Glotzer, Tim Robbins, Morgan Freeman, who were just favouring the version that added a bit more certainty. I think I can delicately put it that way. The ending that we got is the one that adds a little bit more certainty. It went into cinemas. It's worth noting as well, one of the reasons, I didn't know this, that they changed the title, or one of the side effects of it, was they'd had a lot of agents sending in people who could possibly play Rita Hayworth. They'd not read the script, but they'd seen the title. It's just up and down. Anyway, that notwithstanding, the film debuted at the Toronto International Film Festival on September the 10th, 1994. It had cost $25 million. It would debut in US cinemas on the 23rd of September, 1994. The critical response to it, I mean, when you consider how the film is regarded now, I would say the critical response was a bit more 7.5, 8 out of 10. That some really, really went for it, but most people were about 3/4, 4/5 of the way up the charts. Roger Deakins' photography, hugely acclaimed. A couple of people straight away saw this is absolute standout and really, really banged the drum for it. But there was some pushback, quite a lot more pushback than you might expect given the reputation of the film now. That separately, that both Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman got notices that kind of pushed at their performances a little bit. Was it one critic said something along the lines of Forrest Gump goes to jail, and it was less ecstatic than I was expecting, because by the time it came to the UK, it wasn't until like February the year after, and the reviews when it came to the UK were really off the chart. But on the American release and on that Toronto debut, less so. It opened in the US though. That weekend of the 23rd to the 25th, 1994, Columbia Pictures had its deal with Castle Rock and so put the film out into cinemas. They released it into 33 cinemas for its opening weekend, hoping for a very big screen average, and then you build your momentum, and who knows, there might be an awards run in it. And the decision looked vindicated on week one. I mean, it was in 13th place, but on 33 screens, it had a screen average of $22,040. So, I mean, that's the figure to focus on. The gross was $727 million, but to get to a $22,000 screen average, that is a lot. The second highest screen average in the chart was for Robert Redford's Quiz Show. We just lost Robert Redford at the point I'm recording. I adore Quiz Show. That was on its second weekend, and its screen average 13,000. Topping the chart that weekend was Time Cop. I mean, if you're going to lose to anyone, lose to Time Cop. That's a good motto in life. Its screen average was 3,600, but it was a 23 million by that point in the bank, an 8 million opening weekend. In second place was, I really, really like this film, the Charlie Sheen skydiving vehicle Terminal Velocity, which I will happily battle anyone that it's better than Drop Zone. It's a minority opinion, but I'll go for it. Other films around, Forrest Gump was on its 12th week and in third place. Clear and Present Danger, Natural Born Killers, The Mask, and Milk Money, True Lies, Whoopi Goldberg, and Corinna. But the test for the Shawshank Redemption will be what happens when you up the screen count. Well, the second week, they only upped it by 4, stayed in 13th place, screen average still around $16,000. Ed Wood opened on 2 screens that weekend with $35,000 a screen. The River Wild was the number 1 movie on the weekend of September the 30th to October the 2nd. Shawshank went up to 328 screens though on its third weekend of release. So now we're into October the 7th to the 9th, 1994. Screen average still holding around $6,000, but a $2 million gross really. And while the film was having word of mouth, it wasn't really taking off. And instead, the box office top film of that weekend was Sylvester Stallone and Sharon Stone in The Specialist. The nookie scene in The Specialist is still one of the funniest things I've seen in cinema. Also, the bit where basically the top floor of a building falls off, and let's just say it doesn't particularly work in a convincing way. Shawshank's American run would then, I mean, it would gradually expand and gradually expand and gradually expand, and it would hover around the bottom end of the top 10 right till the end of October. But by the time it left US cinemas on its initial run, this was not a home run. $28 million, $35 million budget. It would be remiss to call the film a flop, but you could certainly call it a financial disappointment. It had been in the top 10 for just 3 weeks, and the highest it had got in the US box office chart was 8th place. That was it. Now, much has happened since, of course. And in fact, I remember after the film's initial release, there was a bit of a post-mortem, and they were like, did we get the title of the film wrong? And in fact, I think either Robbins or Freeman was certainly saying, yeah, the title's confusing. What is The Shawshank Redemption? Can you remember that name to recommend it to someone else if you've only heard of it once? Oh, you must say... I've seen the film. I booked it for a film club once upon a time, and I got an invoice that said The Shawshank Redemption. It's like even the film booking people didn't quite know what it was around then. I think it's Simon Mayo on the Kermode and Mayo show says you get a lot of Shawshank, not a lot of Redemption, and it was a confusing title as much as it's known now, and not the kind of title you easily recommend to friends. Time Cop, you know where you stand with that. No wonder Time Cop did great. If Shawshank Redemption had been called Time Cop, who knows what would have happened. But while the post-mortem was going on, there were people watching the film, and there was an Oscar campaign going on. And the start of the Shawshank Redemption, if you like, was when award season started to roll around. Notably, the film got 7 Oscar nominations. It got one for Best Picture, Morgan Freeman for a Best Actor, Frank Darabont's screenplay, the cinematography, the editing, the sound, and the score. It got a couple of Golden Globe nominations. They don't count, obviously. Screen Actors Guild Awards, got nominated for that. Directors Guild of America Awards. It got next to nothing. It won next to nothing. There are a couple. Deakins won from the American Society of Cinematographers, but no Oscars, nothing. In fact, it was bad luck the year it came up at the Oscars, because the 5 Best Picture nominees that year were Quiz Show, which I think is a masterpiece, Pulp Fiction, Forrest Gump, Cultural Phenomenon and a Half, 4 Weddings and a Funeral. It was struggling to displace most of those films. Whatever you think of the merits of them, a couple of them are more cookie cutter for award season. Forrest Gump walked away with an awful lot of stuff. However, then fate took another turn. So the Oscar nominations certainly helped. And I remember going, it was just as it was being nominated for Oscars. It came out in the UK. I went the opening Friday night, the showcase in Aintree. Barely anyone there. This one was a really slow burn. But the Oscar nominations helped. The VHS release helped. Then, in America, the TNT network's headed up by a mogul by the name of Ted Turner, and he was looking for material for his network. And part and parcel of that, he bought up Castle Rock Entertainment. Now, what this meant was that when Shawshank went to television, it didn't go through the traditional networks. It went straight on to Ted Turner's, and he could play this in fast rotation time and time and time again. There's a bunch of film stories of films that were basically discovered because of television. It's a Wonderful Life is an amazing example of that. If it wasn't for television, would it? Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, rotation on television, it finds its audience. Shawshank bubbled up, and then the word of mouth was going. Really going. I remember watching EastEnders here in the UK, soap opera EastEnders, and at one point, and it never happened, one of them said, I've got this video to watch, Shawshank Redemption. So they've never done anything like that before, but it was starting to seep through. Then IMDb came along, and in particular, the votes for the IMDb top 250 films of all time. It looks to me like they've taken some of the tar off the roof that they used in the film, stuck it to the number 1 spot at IMDb top 250, and just stuck Shawshank Redemption to it. It has consistently, the occasional tickle from The Godfather, been rated on IMDb as the #1 film of all time by reader votes. Its legacy and reputation, but just built and built and built and built. And I mean, you can tell really in the same way that my beloved Field of Dreams generated a tourist boom for a baseball field in Iowa. So the Shawshank Redemption started to inspire similarly unexpected trips to the Mansfield area in Ohio. Even though the prison had been levelled a year after the filmmakers had gone, they'd left a couple of bits. A New York Times piece from 2014 revisited the locations and was reporting that, quote, tourism has increased every year since Shawshank had its premiere. In 2013, the movie brought 1,800 visitors to the area and produced an estimated $3 million boost to the local economy. And the prison itself wasn't even there. The oak tree isn't even in that area. But such was the power of, and such is people's love of the Shawshank Redemption. It's a really harsh film as well, that it inspired them to go and see where it was made. For Darabont, he would jump 4 or 5 years on to his next film would be another Stephen King adaptation, The Green Mile, with Tom Hanks. Big Warner Brothers release. Again, lots of Oscar nominations, stuff like that. His other really compelling Stephen King adaptation is The Mist. If you've seen The Mist, you know what I'm on about. But The Shawshank Redemption is regarded by a good chunk of people as one of the greatest films of all time. And as someone who was there on opening night, I got let me just say, there weren't that many people saying that on that particular evening in Aintree. And that brings me to the halfway point of this particular episode of Film Stories. As always, thanks so much for listening. I'm going to do a couple of parish notices and then move straight on to the next film that I'm talking about. But if you like this podcast and don't mind supporting it, then if you head to patreon.com/Simon Brew and put some coins in the pot there, you get it early and ad-free pretty much every time. You find out what I'm up to behind the scenes, all the mischief that I'm causing. There are message boards there that you can join into. That's patreon.com/Simon Brew. Also costing you nothing and gold dust to independent podcasts like this if you can subscribe to the podcast at your home of choice and ideally leave a hugely positive review. Stuff like that makes a huge difference for independent podcasts. Thank you so much to everyone who's done that. Thank you for listening. I mean, I don't know why you do. I'm very, very grateful that you do. I have a couple of live events coming up as well. The one that's on sale is a preview screening of I Swear in Birmingham here in the West Midlands in the UK on Friday the 3rd of October 2025. I'm delighted to say that director Kirk Jones is going to be joining me for that. You can find tickets for that at macbirmingham.co.uk. Just search for Film Stories there. More events are due to be announced shortly, as is the next issue of Film Stories magazine, which is printing as we speak. If you keep your eye on store.filmstories.co.uk, you'll find out a lot more about it. I'll have more information on it in probably the next episode of the podcast. But that is enough parish notices. For the second of the two films I'm talking about, this podcast is recorded the same week that we lost Robert Redford, and I wanted to pay tribute to one of his most underappreciated films that I've talked about quite a bit over the course this past week, actually. So I'm going to tell you that story. I'm going to set it up with an almost dialogue-free clip from the trailer. I'm going to come to the tail of it the other side of this.
This is the Virginia Gene with an SOS call, over. This is the Virginia Gene with an SOS call, over. This is the Virginia Gene with an SOS call, over.
if by some miracle I get to 77 years old, here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to submerge myself in a massive water tank. I'm not going to let people just fire hoses at me, and I've no intention at all of getting an ear infection that will lead to permanent hearing damage. Robert Redford, who we've just lost at the point this has been recorded, did just that for 2013's All Is Lost, and that's the story I'm going to get into next. It's written and directed by J.C. Chandor, and I mean, it stars Robert Redford and a boat and a load of water. Produced by Justin Nappy, Teddy Schwartzman, Neil Dodson and Anna Gerb. A couple of those people will come in. I'm going to name check the cinematographer Peter G. DeMarco and the editor Pete Boudreau as well. This was, I mean, it was a project that J.C. Chandor had he had some vestige of in his mind. He liked the idea of doing an open water thriller. That was basically the genesis of him. Now, J.C. Chandor is a writer-director, and he's gone on to do A Most Violent Year. More recently, Craven the Hunter didn't go so well. But he hadn't broken into movies properly until his 30s. It took him some time. But when he did break through with 2011's Margin Call, a very low-budget film that was scrambled together, whose theatrical release ended up being curtailed for reasons, he ended up with an Oscar nomination. He ended up with acclaim, and he ended up with people ringing his agent, offering him work. And I interviewed him last year, actually, when Craven the Hunter came round. And he confirmed that he was getting offers for big movies at that point. But he had this idea for an open water thriller. And his star was at this point. If you're going to do it, this is a good time to do it. It took a little while, though, from that germ of an idea before he had the eureka moment. Because what he evolved it into was this plan for a film that just had this one character stuck at sea, no other actor on screen, barely any dialogue at all. And so I guess, like, the crude way to describe it is it's Castaway if you take away the start and the end and you take the volleyball away, perhaps putting a boat in the place of the volleyball. And as Chandor said, it's a very simple story about a guy late in his life who goes out on a 4-5 month sail. Fate intervenes. Boy, does it intervene. The boat has an accident, and essentially we go on an 8-day journey with him as he fights to survive. And that is the nuts and bolts of the film. And they plotted out this whole, even the backstory for the boat. Maybe he bought it a few years ago, saving it for a retirement or for a big trip, and then spent a little bit of money to spruce it up, but not too much, and then just went off sailing and just enjoying the pleasures and the serenity and calmness of sailing until the fit absolutely hit the shan. The script then to this just wasn't very long. I mean, I think it's either 51 or 53 words of dialogue in total in the film All Is Lost. And so, I mean, when he sent the script to his producer, Neil Dodson, I think it was, 31 pages. Now, the usual rule of thumb with a screenplay is it's 1 page for 1 minute of screen time. 31 pages. Not unreasonably, Neil Dodson says to J.C. Chandor, where is the rest of the script? No, that is your lot. So another producer, Neil Dodson had worked with him on Margin Call, as had Anna Gerb, and she read it and was really keen to be in it, to be part of it. Really clicked and gelled with it. And also, Chandor had grown up around boats. He wasn't a sailor per se, but he knew the basics. He also knew, as his producers knew, this was going to be a low-budget movie, and it was going to be a really tricky one to make. And so, I mean, the funding in the end came from, and the budget is only about $9 million, $9 million, comes from a matrix of companies: Black Bear Pictures, Treehouse Pictures, Before the Door Pictures, Washington Square Films, Sudden Store Productions. In the end, its distribution was split between Lionsgate, Roadside Attractions, Film Nation, as it went off around the world. But undeniably, the turning point of the All Is Lost story is Robert Redford, and the point where Robert Redford got involved. Margin Call had gone to the Sundance Film Festival. And the Sundance Film Festival, of course, is the creation of the late Robert Redford, that he poured his energies and a lot of his funding into helping independent filmmakers by setting up the Sundance Institute and the associated festival. And as Shandor told Oregon Live, he went to he took Margin Call to Sundance, but before that, I'd had an encounter about a month earlier because Robert Redford takes all the filmmakers at Sundance away from the festival for a welcome brunch. So this was the 2011 festival. And during that talk, Chandor said, there was this weird technical situation with a speaker going in and out behind me. He said, I was in the back of the room, I'd come in a little late, and I had this realisation that he's always been a guy who did his own stunts. I knew that about him. And then this technical glitch kicks in. So the idea of him without a voice became kind of fascinating. And as Shandor said, I did point blank offer to him about a month later this particular film. And I mean, Chandor had mentioned Robert Redford as a possibility to play this character without a name in the film. And as Dodson remembered, he said, look, he's going to say one of two things when he gets this 30-page script. He's either going to say, this sounds great, this sounds amazing, or why would I do that? I'm very much of the latter. Why would I do that? I've got nothing to prove. Why would I put myself through that? And that, I mean, that's the thing. There's still, at 77, the spark of an actor wanting a challenge. Redford liked Chandor, and he also liked the boldness of the script. But also, Chandor had assumed, I think most of us would assume, through all his work with Sundance, that Redford would have been awash with offers from independent films. The great irony of the man who set up Sundance is he wasn't offered independent films. All these independent filmmakers went through his institute, and they didn't offer him a role. And I mean, I struggle to wrap my head around that. And Redford said he doesn't get bombarded with invitations to star in the movies of the filmmakers that he's beating the drum for. And I mean, he says there's something kind of ironic in that. All of these years after starting Sundance and starting the festival, none of the filmmakers that I supported ever hired me. They never offered me a part, he said, until JC. If Redford was one stroke of fortune then for all is lost, the other would be, of all people, David Fincher. Now, David Fincher is not involved in any way with All Is Lost. He's not on the credits. And as we head to, 2010, 2011, he's got Fight Club behind him. He's got Seven behind him. I mean, he's got a ton of movies. He is David Fincher at that point. And so he was in conversation with Disney about doing a big budget take on 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And the idea was that David Fincher's film would be blockbuster level movie, would film on water tanks, and they'd identified Baja Studios in Mexico. Now, Baja Studios in Mexico was basically fundamentally refitted by James Cameron and his team to shoot 1997's Titanic. I mean, it was there for a long time. And so, I mean, it hadn't really had a reinvestment as such in the water tanks till that point. Certainly not a big one. Certainly not the kind of reinvestment to meet David Fincher's exacting standards. So, with Disney and Fincher in development on 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Disney wrote the cheque and paid to have these water tanks, I think it was 3 massive water tanks at Baja Studios, refitted to the demands of a David Fincher blockbuster movie. And so the idea was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea would shoot. If All Is Lost could get a little bit of time in there, absolutely great. But the problem was in the background that Fincher and Disney, I mean, who saw this coming, weren't exactly seeing eye to eye on the direction on this new take of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Disney is spending millions getting the studio's water tanks refitted and modernised. But in the end, Fincher, Disney with like a few million spent. I mean, it's coins down the back of the sofa to Disney, right? But Disney and Fincher parted company, and the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea film hasn't resurrected since. Fincher was talking about it at the start of 2025 on how they had completely different views of what the film was going to be, and the parting of the ways took the project down. Parting of the ways didn't even mean that. I mean, J.C. Chandor, I mean, he and his team just couldn't believe their luck. they were going to be the first beneficiaries of a massive refit of these water tanks that had been paid for by somebody else. Not a cent of it was coming out of their budget outside of the studio hire, and they were going to have access to blockbuster level stuff to make their film. And as Shandor argued, he told me last year, it just suddenly made their film look like it had cost $50 million rather than $8.5 million. It was still an indie film, though, and a lot of the time with indie film, your prep time is really limited. You get no rehearsal time or anything like that. Well, there was a safety issue there, so the prep time was really important, and they did build in 7 weeks at the studios to set everything up properly. It was going to be a tricky shoot, and so as well as Frank G. DeMarco coming in, they brought in a separate underwater director of photography. This is a man called Peter Zuccarini. Peter Zuccarini had worked on the Pirates of the Caribbean film, so he knew his way around shooting on water. In June of 2012, Robert Redford went swimming. Now, shooting took place almost exclusively at the Barger Studios complex, save for a couple of days out in the ocean that they went with a tiny crew to capture footage there. So they had the water. They also they had Robert Redford. They also needed arguably the other main character in the film, the boat. And for this, they decided they needed to use 3, and they had to acquire 3 yachts, nearly 40 feet tall apiece. They needed one to be able to shoot the interiors. They needed another one for just basically the open water stuff, and then another for some of the complicated effects works they needed to do. They also needed to build a rig for certain bits of the film that I won't spoil as well. And it was John Goldsmith was the production designer who was tasked with finding these boats. He was used to working, I mean, he'd worked on The Last Samurai for Ed Zwick and Tom Cruise. He had a budget there. Not here. In this case, he said, we scouted these boats at different times. We purchased them in different ports. It wasn't a case of you put in an order for 3 of the same. They had to find 3 relatively similar boats in completely different places in the end. They all had to be imported, which Goldsmith said was a logistical exercise in itself. And he said, I think we were 2 weeks into prep before all 3 were side by side ready for us to work on. Of those water tanks at the studio, there were 3 that were used, one of which is an infinity tank of sorts that bleeds right to the line of the ocean next door as well. And the physical production meant that the boats were going to be put through the mill. They were going to be sunk. They were going to be raised up, sunk again. They were going to have storms thrown at them, big waves. They were going to take a fair amount of hits. Also, against that, though, one of the things J.C. Chandor realised was you've got no dialogue, and you've got this cinema legend with a very storied face brings his stories along with him just by looking at him. And he wanted to capture moments of him just doing like really trivial stuff. You couldn't usually do that in many films, but if he wants a bite to eat, let's watch him have a bite to eat. Is it a ghost story where we sit and watch Rooney Mara just like eat apart? It's just like it's slowing it down to the most trivial stuff, the smallest of stuff, amongst this massive survival story. Does this man want to survive? Has he got the drive to survive 8 days out at sea? Not spoiling the ending either. So it would be fair to say that Redford didn't massively enjoy the shoot, because this wasn't the kind of production where you could, after every take, just go back to your trailer in front of a nice heater with a cup of cocoa, maybe a nice sandwich. He was stuck in the water. To reset a shot, you weren't going to pull him out of the water unless you absolutely had to. Day after day after day after day, he was in the water. He was being hit by water hoses. He was being hit by waves. And I mean, there was a stunt performer who was used as well, but Redford still wanted to do a lot of his stuff. There's a bit in the film where he climbs to the top of a mast. That's Redford doing it. And he talked about, it was very appealing at me at this point in my life to be able to go back to my roots as an actor, to be interesting enough to have the audience ride along with you and almost be a part of what you're feeling and thinking. However, as he would say in an interview to the New York Times around the film's release, he said, they beat the hell out of me. There were wave, wind and rain machines. There was a crew member who had a giant hose spraying water at his head. that in turn caused damage. It led to an ear infection, and that infection led to, I think it was 60% hearing loss in his left ear as a result of making that film. And J.C. Chandor would say that the grips on the set were agog. They're just like, are we really going to spray Robert Redford with a big power hose? Yeah, they were. And I mean, it was a tight schedule, a budget of under 10 million, not room for many luxuries at all. And Redford said in the end, I was so tired of being wet, and there was no time not to be wet except at night. And so then it was tequila. Part and parcel of it being an independent film meant that reshoots were going to be not a chance. They got their stroke of luck booking into the studio when they did and feeling the benefit of what was there. There was going to be a queue behind them. They couldn't afford to rebook. And so Pete Boudreau, the editor, would basically be doing editing on location to show J.C. Chandor what the film was looking like, because there was no going back once this was done. And against fears of shooting on water and all the difficulties that entailed, they were warned about it before. So never shoot on water. Just ask the people who made Jaws 3D. All is lost shoot, nonetheless, wrapped on time and on budget. Now, there was still quite a lot to be done in post-production on the film. As much as it was physical, they were still shooting on tanks. And he told me last year that they still needed around 1,000 effect shots to put in. Now, these weren't massive explosions or aliens. It was things like putting a convincing sky in the background, getting the background right, fluffing the waves a little bit, just adding a tiny bit more peril. But also, he had the footage that they'd taken from the ocean and the footage in the tanks. And as Chandor would tell Oregon Live, it's essentially a jigsaw puzzle, this edit. You're seeing a lot more real ocean in the movie than the time we actually spent filming it. I mean, such is the way that they were reusing a lot of the material. The film would debut at the Cannes Film Festival on May the 22nd, 2013. And Robert Redford was pretty nervous about this as well, that he didn't particularly want to sit and watch himself on screen. And let's face it, if you're watching All Is Lost, you're just watching Robert Redford on screen. I mean, there aren't that many other places to go. And he sat and watched the film, and I mean, quite angsty and not quite sure what he was going to get, and was greeted by a massive standing ovation at the end. The acclaim for the film was pretty much unanimous, actually. That there was the reviews coming out of Cannes were really, really, really strong, and in particular, it was Robert Redford at the heart of all of that. It was he who was being highlighted as one of his career best performances. Not least that he put himself through all this at this stage in his career and delivered a film where he is the only actor you see, and yet it is absolutely gripping. The running time of the film as well is 105 minutes, and it takes a hell of an actor to be able to be on screen alone pretty much for that time and make us invested and interested. This whole acclaim for it really took Robert Redford by surprise. He would tell the New York Times, it threw me completely. He described how I felt self-conscious and awkward and shy, and I didn't know what to do. And he was talking to his wife about it, and was just like saying, let's go. And he also said, though, to J.C. Chandor, enjoy this moment because it will probably never come again. And it was unusual for him. And the thing with Robert Redford as well, you assume across his career that he got like acting Oscars and things like that no shortage of awards for his leading man role and for his acting role. And yet, if you go down the list of the accolades that he's received for his acting, he's not won an Oscar. He's won an Oscar. Oscars have been in and around his films. If you go to Ordinary People, for instance, in 1980, he gets Best Director for directing that. He'd been nominated for Best Actor once in his career in 1973 for The Sting. He'd been nominated for Best Director twice, Quiz Show as well in 94, as well as Ordinary People. He'd won an honorary Oscar in 2001. There was thought 2013, surely he's in with a chance of getting an Oscar here. Surely this is like the film. No, I'll jump to the end there. No, not a single Academy Award nomination for All Is Lost. And when you consider how good the film is and how good the performance is, it's just absolutely staggering. I still think it's one. If we accept that awards are pretend and awards are nonsense, still, I mean, the overlooking of Redford for All Is Lost is just bizarre. It ends up in cinemas anyway. Let me take you to the US release of the film, October the 18th to the 20th, 2013. All Is Lost gets its... I mean, this is as it tries to build some kind of Oscar run, gets its release in the US on just 6 screens. It gets a $15,000 screen average. The idea is, let's see if we can expand the release of it over time. The film with the biggest screen average that weekend, that opened that weekend on 19 screens, was 12 Years a Slave with $48,000 per screen. I mean, it blitzed everything. 12 Years a Slave would go on to win the Best Picture Academy Award the following year. All Is Lost, I mean, I've discussed, it just wouldn't. And in fact, if I pull up the chart as it expands onto 82 screens the following week, screen average is stuck at around $6,000, doesn't really go much further. The top of the chart that second week was Jackass Presents Bad Grandpa with a higher screen average. Imagine that. You don't have to, it actually happened. And All Is Lost, I mean, it never really broke through. By the time it had finished its US release, the highest it had got in the US box office chart was, I think it got in the end over one weekend up to 12th place. With 1.1 million in the bank on one weekend. That was it. Other than that, I mean, I wouldn't say it sank because that would just be a terrible gag and I wouldn't do that. But 6.2 million at the US box office. Outside of the US, it would do 7.3 million. Total worldwide gross, 13.6 million. The point this has been recorded is in the week after the death of Robert Redford. And I mean, I've written a fair amount in this past week. I've recorded stuff a fair amount in this past week. And I mean, you could throw a dart at Redford's IMDb page. You're going to find something worth watching. The one that loads of people missed in 2013 and the one that keeps being omitted when people are writing these wonderful tributes to Robert Redford, I would suggest is All Is Lost. For J.C. Chandor, he would go on to do A Most Violent Year. What a run of 3 films that is. Margin Call, All Is Lost, A Most Violent Year. I think All Is Lost is his best film, personally. I think it's one of Robert Redford's best films as well, and absolutely one of his best performances. Rest in peace, Robert. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. If I have not bored you completely, you can find more from me on Instagram, simon.brew, on Blue Sky, Simon Brew. Film Stories is on Instagram, Film Stories Magazine UK, Blue Sky, Film Stories, Facebook, Film Stories Online, YouTube, Film Stories, and then you can find our online shop, store.filmstories.co.uk, where you can find our print film magazines. Imagine who would be mad enough to do independent print film magazines in this economy. Yep, that's us. Our 168-page flagship Film Stories magazine, the new issue about to go on sale. Film Junior for sale there as well. Also at the store, you'll find our UK exclusive Blu-rays of No Way Out and Bull Durham with Film Stories extras on as well. If you head to filmstories.co.uk, meanwhile, that is a clickbait and AI-free entertainment website. God knows how long we can keep doing such things like that, but we're going to keep trying. Thank you to everybody who supports and visits and keeps championing the Film Stories project. I will have news soon 2 of events to mark Film Stories 500. The 500th episode of this podcast is coming up, bizarrely. It's as much a surprise to me as it is to you, but I'll have more on that shortly. For now, though, I'm off to watch another load of movies and to get working on the next bunch of podcasts. So all that's left for me to say is for you all to take care and look after yourselves. That's the main thing. Stay healthy, stay well. I'll be back soon with another bunch of Film Stories. Thanks a lot, folks. Bye-bye. then just a very, very brief post-credits bit to thank you for thank those of you who got in touch again. I've had some lovely notes again over the last week or so. For those who've been following the post-credits stings that I now seem to be doing on most of these podcast episodes, I've got a special episode of the podcast coming up shortly, assuming it all goes through, which is one of the most extraordinary interviews I think I've done, more down to inevitably the subject rather than me. It's quite something, and I'm working on quite a lot of interviews behind the scenes that I build at Film Stories 500, as well as special guests for that as well. But I mean, it's interesting. There's still so many stories out there that I'm trying to mine and I'm trying to find out. And I know that it's against a backdrop of loads of you, and I've been speaking to a few of you, going through some just awful stuff at the moment, notwithstanding the state of the world, which I ain't getting into. I know lots of you are battling individual pressures. So if I can just send, I don't know whether this makes the slightest bit of difference. My pieces of inverted commas wisdom are: look after your heads at all costs. You can't look after anyone else unless you look after yourself. And also, if good things are driving by you, run towards them at speed, because I'm increasingly find the bad stuff will always find you, does not need a helping hand. The good stuff, it does. Be back soon. Thanks for listening, and thanks for all your support.